What if I told you that in the icy shadow of the Viking Age there were rituals so disturbing, so intimate in their cruelty, that even the hardened warriors of the medieval world shuddered at their mention? This is not a legend born from fireside tales. It is history documented by those who saw it with their own eyes. Tonight, we will walk with a foreign diplomat who journeyed into the frozen north and returned with a story that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Stay with me until the end, because the truth will shake your understanding of what civilization really means. And if you dare to pull back the veil of history's darkest corners, hit that subscribe button now. In the year 922 AD, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmed ibn Fadlan traveled through the lands of the Rus on a mission of statecraft. But what he encountered was not the courtly diplomacy he had expected. Instead, he stepped into a world where power, sexuality, and violence were woven together into a single, unbreakable chain. To the Vikings, dominance in bed was as essential to a man's honor as dominance on the battlefield. And to fall short in either arena could cost you not just your reputation, but your life. From the moment he entered their encampments, Ibn Fadlan was struck by the raw, unfiltered brutality of Viking life. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine and unwashed bodies, the clang of iron mingling with drunken laughter. Men sprawled across furs with their weapons beside them, women moved with a confidence rarely seen in medieval Europe, and slaves, silent, hollow-eyed, moved between them like shadows. But beneath the rough charm and apparent freedom was a social order, sharper than any blade. At the heart of that order were two deadly words, ergi and ragger. These terms didn't just describe sexual passivity, they defined it as the ultimate disgrace. To be accused of being on the receiving end in an intimate act was not merely an insult. It was a social death sentence. Viking law was brutally clear: you could kill a man for such an accusation, and the courts would let you walk free. Masculinity was a fortress, and any crack in its walls had to be sealed with blood. The sagas are littered with tales of blood feuds sparked by these accusations. One careless word in a mead hall could trigger a chain of killings stretching across years and miles. A whispered rumor about a man's weakness could strip him of his rights, his property, and his standing in the community. In a society obsessed with dominance, a man's sexual role was not just private, it was public currency, and losing it meant losing everything. Ibn Fadlan soon realized that this obsession with sexual dominance was not limited to insults, it was weaponized. The Vikings used sexual humiliation as a calculated form of psychological warfare. For them, breaking an enemy's body was one thing. Breaking his spirit, his manhood, was far more devastating. They had a word for one of their most grotesque practices, klumhog the shame. Stroke a deliberate cut to a man's buttocks to mark him as penetrated even if no act had occurred. But often, the Vikings didn't stop at symbolism. Captured kings and warriors were sometimes publicly violated, the act serving as a brutal announcement: your masculinity has been stolen, your honor devoured. According to their belief, forcing an enemy into the passive role didn't just humiliate him, it transferred his masculine essence to the victor. Such a man could never return home with his head held high. Some took their own lives rather than live branded as unmanly. For those who survived, exile was often the only option. They became wandering outcasts, living reminders of Viking supremacy. The scale of sexual enslavement was staggering. In Dublin, in York, the markets bustled with human beings divided like livestock, the most beautiful set aside for the personal pleasure of chieftains. To be a captive was to be stripped not just of freedom, but of humanity itself. The law codified the cruelty. Free women had strong protections against sexual assault. Captives had none. To harm a slave was treated as damaging property, a crime measured in silver, not blood. Archaeology suggests that in some Viking settlements, slaves made up nearly 1/3 of the population, many taken specifically for sexual exploitation. And this was no secret; its very notoriety became a weapon. Villages would surrender without a fight, rather than risk the fate of the conquered. Even marriage among the free was steeped in sexual display. Viking weddings were not private unions, but public contracts sealed by the witnessing of consummation. Families gathered, sometimes even remaining in the room to verify the act. Without proof, often in the form of blood-stained sheets, the marriage could be annulled, dowries returned, and reputations ruined. In this world, intimacy was never yours alone. It belonged to the law, to the clan, to the cold, unyielding gaze of society. The rituals surrounding these weddings carried layers of symbolism so overt that no one could pretend they didn't understand them. One of the most striking was the placement of Thor's hammer Mjolnir upon the bride's lap during the ceremony. To the Vikings, it was a clear fertility blessing, a phallic token meant to ensure the union produced heirs. The hammer would be blessed by a priest and passed among the guests to touch, turning the moment into a communal sexual ritual, thinly veiled as religious devotion. Once the ceremonial words were spoken, the groom removed the bride's crown, a public signal that her virginity would soon be claimed. Witnesses would escort the couple to the marriage bed, murmuring blessings that were half prayer, half explicit suggestion. In the stillness outside the door, relatives listened for sounds of completion, their faces set in an unsettling mixture of solemn duty and thinly disguised curiosity. If the bride was found not to be a virgin, her family could be accused of fraud, facing heavy fines, or worse. If the groom could not perform, the bride's kin might demand compensation for what they viewed as damaged goods. The Icelandic legal codes spelled out penalties for these failures in the same precise language used for disputes over land or livestock. In Viking eyes, intimacy was another form of property transaction, as much a part of commerce as the buying of a ship or the trade of furs. But of all the customs, Ibn Fadlan recorded, none was as horrifying as the funeral rites of a Viking chieftain. His account begins with the selection of a slave girl to accompany the dead into the afterlife. The choice was voluntary in name only, for the pressure to honor one's master was immense. Once chosen, she became both revered and doomed a sacred vessel through which the tribe believed they could transfer their collective life force. In the days before the funeral, the girl was plied with alcohol and narcotics, her senses dulled, her resistance erased. Men of the tribe took turns with her, each act accompanied by a message to the dead. "Tell your master, I did this for him." They believed that through her body, their strength, their essence would flow into the chieftain's spirit, arming him for his journey to Valhalla. On the day itself, she was led to a pavilion erected beside the funeral ship. Inside, 6 men awaited her, each representing a different power within the tribe: war, wealth, fertility, wisdom, the hunt, the sea. When they were done, she was laid beside her master's corpse. Then came the Angel of Death, an old woman who looped a cord around the girl's neck while simultaneously driving a blade into her chest. It was a killing both ritualized and intimate, a final merging of violence and belief. The ship was set alight, flames licking the night sky as the tribe chanted prayers. To them, it was a sacred release. To modern eyes, it was one of history's most organized acts of sexual violence disguised as religion. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia have confirmed similar burials young women interred, alongside powerful men, often with signs of violent death. The stories once dismissed as fantasy now stand grimly proven in the soil, and yet Viking society was not a monolith of male dominance. Free Viking women enjoyed rights unheard of in most of medieval Europe. They could divorce their husbands for sexual inadequacy, own land-run businesses, even propose marriage. The sagas are filled with strong female figures, wealthy merchants, ship captains, and political brokers. On the surface, it might seem a contradiction, but those rights applied only to the free. The same legal codes that protected a noblewoman's consent stated explicitly that a slave woman's body belonged to her owner. By elevating the status of free women, Viking society sharpened the contrast with those enslaved, making the degradation of the latter all the more complete. Even some free women benefiting from this structure encouraged the enslavement of others to safeguard their own position. The contradictions ran deeper still. Female infants, if considered an economic burden, could be exposed to the elements to die. The sagas mention such acts casually without moral comment, as though they were another tool for maintaining the social order. In this, as in so much of Viking life, notions of honor, power, and survival were bound together in ways that defy modern morality, and yet reveal uncomfortable truths about how societies preserve themselves. Viking attitudes towards same-sex relationships added yet another layer to their complex sexual hierarchy. In the sagas, men could take both wives and male lovers without social penalty, so long as they maintained the active role. To penetrate was to dominate. To be penetrated was to surrender one's manhood entirely. It wasn't about orientation, it was about power and who held it in any given moment. Even the gods were not immune to these judgments. Loki the trickster was mocked for taking female form and even bearing children, one of them, the monstrous eight-legged horse Sleipnir. Odin, king of the gods, was criticized for practicing satyr, a form of magic associated with women. These divine examples reinforced the idea that straying from masculine dominance, even in the realm of the supernatural, carried the stench of shame. In practice, this meant that accusations of sexual passivity could be more dangerous than accusations of theft or even murder. Viking law treated false claims of ergi as gravely as homicide, with penalties designed to deter anyone from casually slandering another man's masculinity. It was a fragile, brittle kind of honor, one that could be shattered by a single insult. Public justice often doubled as performance. Trials for sexual crimes could end in executions staged like theater. Rapists might face the same sexual violation they had inflicted, carried out in full view of the community. Adulterers could be castrated in front of cheering crowds. The punishment was not just to kill, but to humiliate, to invert the power dynamic before extinguishing the offender's life. These spectacles served a dual purpose. They reinforced the social hierarchy and provided mass entertainment. In a culture that celebrated physical dominance, there was grim satisfaction in watching justice delivered through the same tools, violence, and sexual power that upheld the system in the first place. The line between morality and spectacle blurred until they became one. Festivals sometimes included events where captured enemies were forced into degrading acts for the amusement of the crowd. The Vikinga saga describes competitions in which prisoners endured escalating forms of sexual humiliation until death or madness claimed them. The audience wagered on who would last the longest, treating human suffering as sport. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts with unsettling clarity. Execution sites show patterns of mutilation that go far beyond killing, cuts, burns, and injuries suggesting intentional sexual humiliation. The dead tell no tales, but the marks on their bones speak volumes about the society that ended their lives. For the Vikings, these practices were not random acts of cruelty. They were strategies, calculated uses of sex and violence to maintain control. Every humiliation, every assault, every ritual was part of an unspoken system that welded dominance to identity. It was a code enforced not just by warriors but by the community itself. This legacy did not vanish with the end of the Viking Age. Ideas about masculinity, as dominance, about sex, as a tool of control, seeped into the cultures they touched. Through conquest, trade, and migration, these concepts traveled across Europe, influencing laws, customs, and even language. the echoes of those ancient mead halls still reverberate in modern notions of honor and shame. Looking back, it's tempting to dismiss these stories as relics of a brutal past, but to do so would be to miss the point. The Vikings remind us that the most dangerous systems are the ones that hide in plain sight, those that cloak cruelty and ritual, call violence honor, and turn human bodies into currency for power. Their world may be gone, but the patterns they forged remain woven into the fabric of ours. The chilling thing about Ibn Fadlan's account is how calmly it was written. There is no hysteria, no exaggerated horror, just the cold, methodical recording of events as they unfolded. Perhaps that is what makes it so disturbing, the matter-of-fact way these acts were treated by those who carried them out, as though sexual violence was simply another line item in the duties of a Viking chieftain's funeral. In his writings, the slave girl's final days were recounted almost clinically. The feasts she attended, the wine and ale she drank, the repeated encounters she endured. Each step was presented as tradition, sanctified by generations and approved by the elders. For the Vikings, there was nothing shameful here, only the fulfillment of an ancient covenant between the living and the dead. But if Ibn Fadlan's words stripped away the romance of the Viking image, the archaeological discoveries centuries later hammered the final nails into that coffin. Ship burials across Scandinavia revealed the remains of young women alongside high-status men, often with clear signs of violent death. What had once been doubted as enemy propaganda was now undeniable fact. This is the paradox that continues to haunt historians, a society that gave free women legal rights unheard of in medieval Europe, yet normalized the industrial-scale sexual exploitation of slaves. A people who celebrated courage, yet used humiliation as a weapon more cutting than any sword. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a culture that made these contradictions not in spite of its values, but because of them. To understand the Vikings is to accept that they saw no contradiction in these beliefs. To them, the world was divided sharply between those who commanded and those who obeyed, those who dominated and those who submitted. Every law, every ritual, every insult reinforced that division, and nowhere was this more visible than in their sexual customs. The sagas themselves, those epic tales sung by skalds and passed down for centuries, are saturated with these values. Heroes are lauded for their ability to conquer both on the battlefield and in bed. Villains are mocked not for cruelty, but for unmanliness. Insults carry more weight than wounds, and death, when it comes, is preferable to dishonor. Even women could wield these weapons. A wife might ruin her husband's reputation with a few well-placed words, questioning his vigor or his boldness. In a society where masculinity was everything, such accusations could start blood feuds, topple alliances, and end lives. The power of the tongue in Viking hands could be as lethal as any axe. Yet for all the brutality, the Vikings saw themselves as honorable. Their laws were precise, their punishments consistent, their rituals rooted in belief. They did not act in chaos. They acted within a framework they considered just. It is this self-assurance, this certainty in the righteousness of their own system that makes their history so unnerving. Because when cruelty is wrapped in the cloak of tradition, it ceases to feel like cruelty to those who practice it. It becomes duty, it becomes identity. And in that transformation lies the true danger, the ease with which humanity can turn its back on empathy when convinced that the cause is noble. So, when we think of the Vikings not as horn-helmeted caricatures but as real people, we must remember that their legacy is more than the longships and the raids. It is the enduring lesson that power, when left unchecked, will always find ways to sanctify its own excesses. Whether through the law, the sword, or the marriage bed, domination will disguise itself as honor until someone dares to name it for what it is. One of the most haunting elements in these accounts is the casualness with which life and death were decided. A man's worth could hinge on a drunken jest, a whispered insult, or a perceived failure in bed. Entire feuds began over such slights, consuming families and spilling blood across fjords and valleys. And all the while, the sagas preserved these tales as if they were worthy of song. For the Vikings, sexual humiliation was not a byproduct of war, it was a deliberate tactic. To strip an enemy of his masculinity was to destroy his ability to command loyalty or inspire fear. The physical wounds could heal, the social wounds never did. That was the brilliance and the horror of their strategy. Captured leaders were paraded before their people not just in chains, but in disgrace. In some cases, they were subjected to acts designed to mark them forever, as the passive partner, ensuring they could never reclaim their status. These public displays were as much for the victor's morale as for the victim's shame. The markets of Dublin and York thrived on this human spoils system. Slaves were sorted, valued, and sold with a brutal efficiency that treated them as nothing more than living coin. The most attractive women were reserved for the elite, while others were sent to serve in distant farms or mines. It was an industry built on the backs and the bodies of the conquered, and yet within the walls of the Longhouse the free lived by a different set of rules. Marriages were public affairs, family alliances sealed not just with vows, but with physical proof of consummation. Privacy was a luxury, and intimacy was something to be witnessed, recorded, and if necessary, contested in court. In one saga, a bride's uncle remained in the room during her wedding night to ensure the act was completed to the satisfaction of all parties. This was not seen as strange, but as prudent an insurance policy against future disputes. The boundary between the personal and the political was paper-thin. Such customs may seem alien to us, but they made perfect sense in a society where inheritance, alliance, and honor were everything. A marriage without proof of consummation could unravel decades of political maneuvering. And so, the bedroom became an extension of the battlefield where victories and defeats were recorded, not in blood, but in reputation. The funeral rites, however, remained the most visceral expression of Viking belief. The selection of a slave girl to follow her master in death was framed as an honor, but it was an honor paid for with suffering. The tribe believed her spirit would serve him in Valhalla, but her body was first claimed by the living. Ibn Fadlan's description of that final day is unflinching. The girl, drugged and compliant, is led to the pavilion where 6 men await. Each takes his turn murmuring messages for her to deliver to the dead. Then the angel of death steps forward, cord in hand, blade ready. It is a ritual, both intimate and executioner's work, performed without hesitation. As the funeral ship burned, the tribe's chants rose above the crackle of the flames. In their minds, they had sent their chieftain to the afterlife, fully armed with the strength of his people. In hours, they had committed one of the most calculated acts of sexual violence in history. And in the charred remains left behind, archaeologists would one day find the bones that proved these stories were no exaggeration. Over time, historians tried to explain these customs through the lens of necessity. In a harsh northern world where survival was never guaranteed, the Vikings fused violence and intimacy into tools of control. Every act reinforced the boundaries between the free and the enslaved, the dominant and the submissive, the insider and the outsider. Free women's rights, rare for the era, were often cited as proof of Viking progressiveness. But this was a selective freedom, one that existed only because the line between free and enslaved was kept stark and cruel. To grant choice to one group, they removed it entirely from another. It was a system that needed both privilege and oppression to function. Some free women not only accepted this balance, but actively enforced it. The sagas speak of wives who encouraged husbands, brothers, and sons to commit acts of sexual violence against enemies, framing it as an act of honor. Their own autonomy depended on a world where others had none. The treatment of infants reveals another chilling truth. Baby girls deemed too costly to raise were sometimes abandoned, left in the cold, exposed to animals or the elements. These acts were recounted without outrage, as though they were simply practical decisions in the grand economy of survival. Viking law itself read like a ledger of dominance. It outlined protections for free women's consent in explicit detail, while just as clearly stating that slaves were property to be used at their owner's discretion. To them, there was no contradiction, only the order of the world, written in runes and enforced with steel. This binary extended to their views on masculinity. A man's public image was as important as his deeds. Clothing that seemed too feminine, speech that lacked aggression, even a failure to defend one's honor, these could all spark ridicule or worse. The sagas are full of divorces granted on such grounds where a wife declared her husband unmanly for failing to live up to these ideals. Homosexual relations, too, were judged not by the gender of one's partner but by the role one played. The active partner retained honor. The passive partner lost it entirely. This code was policed not only through whispers, but through law, with false accusations carrying punishments as severe as murder. Religion reflected these same hierarchies. The gods themselves could be shamed for crossing perceived sexual boundaries. Odin's practice of satyr, a magic associated with women, was both feared and mocked. Loki's transformations into female form were remembered as much for their sexual implications as for their trickery. Such stories served as warnings, reinforcing the rules by showing what happened to even the mightiest when they strayed from the path of dominance. In a culture built on conquest, control over the body, yours and others, was inseparable from control over land, wealth, and destiny. And so the Vikings sailed, carrying these beliefs with them like cargo. In every raid, every market, every marriage and funeral, the same principles applied. Sex and violence were not separate domains. They were two edges of the same axe, swung with purpose, precision, and a certainty that they were wielding the tools of honor. As the centuries passed, the image of the Viking shifted in popular memory. Poets and painters turned them into romanticized explorers, fearless warriors under golden sunsets. But the bones, buried beneath the soil, told another story, one of calculated cruelty, where rituals of humiliation were as sacred as any prayer to the gods. The archaeological digs in places like Oseberg and Birka forced modern audiences to confront these truths. Here were the charred remains of young women buried with high-status men, some showing signs of violent death. The evidence stripped away the comforting layer of legend, leaving only the raw, unvarnished reality that Ibn Fadlan had recorded. It is easy to condemn them now with centuries of moral distance, but the Vikings did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were preserving honor, strengthening their people, and following the will of their gods. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of their story. Cruelty does not always come dressed as chaos. It can wear the mask of order. Their laws, rituals, and social codes were clear and consistent, providing the illusion of fairness even as they enshrined domination. In the mead halls, a man could recite the exact clause that justified an act of humiliation or violence, just as easily as he could list his ancestors. The rules were not broken. They were designed this way, and those rules traveled with them. From the Irish coast to the rivers of Russia, conquered peoples encountered not just Viking swords, but Viking customs. The threat of sexual violence became a weapon as powerful as any blade, capable of breaking the will of entire communities before a single drop of blood was spilled. The legacy of this intertwining of sex and power did not end with the Viking Age. Concepts of masculinity tied to dominance, the use of humiliation as social control, and the commodification of human bodies, all of these ideas filtered into the cultures they touched. Some became embedded so deeply that we no longer recognize their origins. When we look back at the sagas now, they read not only as entertainment or history, but as coded instruction manuals for a way of life that thrived on control. They taught listeners how to maintain honor, how to shame rivals, and how to enforce the boundaries that kept their society intact. Violence and intimacy were simply two parts of the same narrative. The modern fascination with Vikings often skips over these details, preferring the romance of longships and discovery. But ignoring the darker truths means ignoring the full picture. These were not just adventurers. They were architects of a system where dominance defined worth and where breaking a man's spirit was valued more than ending his life. Perhaps that is the true warning they leave us, that systems of oppression rarely see themselves as such. They are built on shared beliefs, rituals, and laws that feel as natural to their practitioners as breathing. By the time anyone questions them, they have already shaped the very definitions of honor, strength, and humanity. So, the next time you hear the distant echo of a war horn, or imagine the sweep of a dragon-headed prow against the horizon, remember the other cargo those ships carried. Not just gold, not just weapons, but ideas. Ideas forged in fire and blood, carried on the wind and embedded in the human story. Ideas that remind us that the darkest legacies are not always the ones we can see. They are the ones still living in the ways we think, act, and believe today.